This is Yashidu, a yokai whose body grows whenever she receives genuine praise. And although most people would probably treat becoming 8 feet tall like a supernatural emergency, Yashidu actually prefers her original height. The smaller body she has now is not her true form at all. It is simply what remains after years of losing confidence in herself. The real question is whether Seiichiro can help her recover the strength she once had, or whether these two will become distracted by something far more dangerous than any ghost story, developing feelings for each other. The legend surrounding Hakusama describes a mysterious 8-foot-tall woman, dressed entirely in white, who appears along lonely countryside roads. According to the old stories, she searches for children and carries away anyone who catches her interest, because once Hakusama chooses someone, escaping her grasp is nearly impossible. That should have been enough to keep her reputation terrifying for generations. Unfortunately, humans have a special talent for taking something frightening and somehow making it weird. Over time, the public stopped treating Hakusama like a dangerous supernatural being and began viewing her as a much more suggestive kind of spirit. For an ordinary person, a bad reputation is embarrassing. For a yokai, it can physically alter their existence. Spirits gain or lose power based on the image humans hold of them. And when that image changes enough, even their bodies can transform. Yachiru is the real Hakusama hiding among humans, and the public's distorted view of her has steadily weakened her powers. Her strength has faded, her confidence has collapsed, and even her once imposing height has begun shrinking. The situation has gotten so bad that she no longer has the courage to confront the people ruining her name. She has tried defending herself before, but none of those attempts went particularly well. At one point, she started a live stream while wearing a mask and announced that she was the true Hakusama, hoping to correct everyone's misconceptions. Instead of listening to her explanation, the viewers immediately filled the comments with exactly the kind of messages she was trying to stop. She entered the stream hoping to restore centuries of supernatural dignity and left knowing the internet had somehow made the problem worse. Yachiru later accepted a part-time job at a haunted house, believing that appearing as Hakusama in a proper horror setting might finally remind people that she was supposed to be scary. Unfortunately, she barely managed to take a step before getting tangled in a pile of electrical cords. Rather than screaming in terror, one visitor asked whether she was supposed to be Hakusama and complained that they had paid to be frightened, not to witness some strange performance. Not long afterward, Yachiru was fired. At this point, the poor woman was collecting failures faster than she was collecting fear, but she still refused to give up. Her next plan was to study horror directly by visiting a cinema and watching a movie famous for terrifying audiences. If she could understand what made fictional monsters frightening, perhaps she could use those techniques to repair her own image. Even while preparing for this personal mission, Yachiru remained considerate of everyone around her. Since she was still unusually tall compared to most humans, she chose a seat near the back so she would not block anyone's view. However, just before entering the theater, she took another look at the movie poster and immediately began reconsidering every decision that had brought her there. Still, she forced herself forward. She was an actual yokai, after all. There was no logical reason for her to fear a monster created for entertainment. She would watch carefully, memorize everything it did, and turn those techniques into her own. At least, that was the plan before the movie started. Yachiru did not study a single thing. She could barely keep her eyes on the screen, much less take useful notes. The movie frightened her so badly that her entire body went cold, leaving her dizzy, nauseous, and barely able to stand. By the time she made it outside, she was sitting on the ground and wondering how she had managed to fail yet again. The live stream had failed, the haunted house job had failed, and now even watching a scary movie had defeated the supposedly terrifying Hakusama. While she sat there overwhelmed by those thoughts, someone approached from behind. Yachiru noticed him immediately and apologized before he could even say anything, assuming she must be in his way. However, the young man was not annoyed. He only wanted to know whether she was all right and asked if she had been hurt when she fell earlier. Yachiru looked up and quickly assured him that she was fine, but the moment she realized she was still blocking the path, she panicked again. She scrambled to her feet, thanked him for worrying about her, and hurried away despite still looking unsteady. As he watched her leave, the young man quietly noted that it had been a long time since he had met someone taller than himself, especially a woman. He then noticed an umbrella lying where Yachiru had been sitting. Realizing she must have dropped it during her rushed escape, he picked it up and searched the area. She could not have gone very far in her condition, and sure enough, he spotted her across the road near a vending machine. He crossed over and returned the umbrella, earning another nervous thank you from her. Then, after noticing that she still looked pale, purchased a bottle of water and handed it to her as well. Yachiru immediately offered to pay him back, but he refused, pointing out that he had chosen to buy it for her. She tried protesting once more, but another wave of dizziness ended the argument quickly. She opened the bottle and drank almost all of it at once. After catching her breath, Yachiru apologized yet again and admitted that she felt much better. She promised she would rest once she returned home, though she seemed embarrassed to explain what had happened. Eventually, she confessed that the movie had made her lightheaded. Instead of laughing, the young man reassured her that horror movies could be difficult for someone who was not accustomed to them. He had originally planned to leave after giving her the water, but seeing how unsteady she remained, he decided to stay a little longer and make sure she could safely get home. Yachiru, however, became more interested in something else he had said. His comment suggested that people could become accustomed to horror with enough experience. If that was true, perhaps she could try watching the movie again later. The young man was understandably confused and asked why she was pushing herself so hard. Without revealing her true identity, Yachiru explained that she had recently worked at a haunted house and wanted to become better at frightening people. That was why she had come to study the movie. Her answer genuinely impressed him, and he immediately asked which monster she had played. Yachiru hesitated, before quietly answering that she had portrayed Haku-sama. She tightened her grip around the empty bottle, already preparing herself for the reaction she had received so many times before. Surely he would mention the indecent version of the legend that everyone now talked about. Instead, the young man looked completely serious and corrected her. Haku-sama, he insisted, was not some shameless spirit. She was a genuine and frightening yokai from an old countryside legend. He became so passionate about the subject that it sounded less like a casual correction. Yachiru admitted that she already knew the original legend. She had only described it differently because the distorted version was easier for most people to recognize now. Hearing that her reputation had been dragged so far from its origin visibly frustrated him. He apologized for becoming overly excited, then explained that he had loved horror since childhood and that Haku-sama held a special place among all the stories he knew. Unable to stop herself, Yachiru asked what exactly he liked about her legend. That was all the permission he needed. He began describing everything he admired about Haku-sama, her mysterious appearance, her overwhelming height, the uneasiness created by her white dress, and the terrifying idea that anyone she chose could never escape her. More than anything, he hated how modern people had twisted her image into something cheap. To him, Haku-sama was not ridiculous or embarrassing. She was his favorite yokai, his favorite female spirit, and possibly the most fascinating supernatural being he had ever learned about. By the time he finally realized how much he had been talking, he awkwardly apologized for going too far. But Yachiru was no longer listening normally. Her face had turned bright red, her body felt strangely warm, and without realizing it, she had begun growing. Yachiru's face turned completely red, as her body suddenly began returning to its former size. Seichiro stared at her in shock, while she tilted her head and wondered why he looked so much smaller than he had a moment ago. It took her a few seconds to understand that he had not shrunk at all. She was the one who had grown. The realization sent her into an immediate panic. She began waving her arms around, lost her balance, and fell directly on top of him before either of them could react. Yachiru quickly asked whether he was hurt, but Seichiro could barely answer while being pinned beneath her. He managed to ask her to get off first, and she immediately scrambled away, apologizing over and over as he caught his breath. From a distance, someone briefly wondered whether the tall woman had just grown even larger, but after looking again, they convinced themselves that they must have imagined it. By then, Yachiru had already returned to her weakened size. She stared at her hands in disbelief. This was the first time in a long while that she had regained even a portion of her former power. The change had happened directly after Seichiro praised Haku-sama, which made her wonder whether he had somehow caused it. Seichiro was thinking along similar lines, though his conclusion was even more unbelievable. For a moment, he wondered whether the woman standing in front of him could actually be Haku-sama. He immediately tried dismissing the thought, but after what he had just witnessed, pretending nothing strange had happened was no longer an option. The two moved to a nearby cafe where they could speak privately. Once seated, Yachiru finally revealed the truth about herself. She explained that she was the real Haku-sama and that her powers had weakened as people's image of her changed. Seichiro introduced himself properly as Seichiro Kiri, then asked why she had invited him there instead of simply disappearing after revealing something so important. Yachiru admitted that she needed his help. For the first time in years, her strength had briefly returned, and it had happened while he was praising her. Since Seichiro knew so much about Haku-sama, she hoped he might be able to help her understand what triggered the transformation. If she discovered a way to restore her power, she might be able to remain at her original height and finally recover the confidence she had lost. She knew it was shameless to ask someone she had only just met for such a favor, but she had already run out of ideas. Seichiro agreed without hesitation. He disliked what people had turned Haku-sama into, and helping her restore the original image of the legend was something he genuinely wanted to do. He also had plenty of free time during summer vacation, so there was no reason for him to refuse. Yachiru, relieved by his answer, asked whether there was anything she could give him in return. Seichiro told her that being allowed to help his favorite yokai was already more than enough. However, one question suddenly entered his mind. If Yachiru regained all of her strength, would she begin kidnapping children again like the legend claimed? Yachiru slammed both hands down and shouted that she had never kidnapped children. It was only part of the old story. Her sudden outburst knocked over the glass on the table, spilling water everywhere and immediately turning her anger into embarrassment. She began apologizing, but Seiichiro stopped her and admitted that he was the one who had asked a rude question. He had never truly believed she would hurt anyone, but he wanted to understand how closely the real Yachiru matched the legend. That question affected her more than he expected. Yachiru explained that humans had always held different images of Haku-sama. Some viewed her as a monster, while others believed the stranger versions of the legend. After her failed livestream and the disaster at the haunted house, she had begun to realize that the public's opinion was not her only problem. Deep down, she had also started believing that she was a failure. Even after hearing Seiichiro praise her so sincerely, part of her still felt that she did not deserve any of it. Seiichiro carefully told her that, from everything he had seen, he could not imagine her harming anyone. She was thoughtful enough to sit at the back of a theater so she would not block the screen, and even while sick, she had worried about inconveniencing strangers. His question had been careless, but it did not change what he thought of her. Yachiru still looked unconvinced, so Seiichiro continued. He told her that he thought she was impressive. It required courage to live stream in front of strangers and even more courage to work at a haunted house after her first attempt failed. She had forced herself to watch a movie she hated because she wanted to improve, and she had even considered watching it a second time despite nearly collapsing after the first. Then, after meeting someone she barely knew, she had gathered enough courage to reveal her identity and ask for help. From his perspective, none of that made her weak or pathetic. It proved that she had continued trying despite being disappointed again and again. Hearing someone acknowledge her effort so directly broke through the confidence she had spent years losing. Yachiru began crying and admitted that perhaps receiving a little praise was not so bad. At the same time, she noticed the same strange, tingling feeling passing through her body. It was exactly what she had felt when Seiichiro praised Haku-sama outside the theater. Seiichiro finally connected the pieces. Since a yokai's strength was influenced by the way humans viewed them, his perception of Yachiru should also affect her. His praise might temporarily restore the power she had lost. Words alone could be enough to change her body because, for a spirit like her, human belief carried real power. Seiichiro was immediately eager to test the theory. Yachiru barely had time to ask whether he intended to do it inside the cafe before he began praising her again. He spoke about her courage, her dedication, and everything he admired about Haku-sama. The result was instant. Yachiru rapidly increased in size, nearly destroying the chair beneath her as her clothing struggled to keep up with the transformation. Both of them realized at the same time that the middle of a public cafe was probably the worst possible location for this experiment. Yachiru shrank again soon afterward and sighed in relief when it appeared that no one nearby had noticed what happened. Chiro removed his jacket and passed it across the table so she could cover herself. He apologized for acting without thinking and promised that they would choose a more private location next time. Yachiru accepted the jacket and thanked him. More importantly, she told Seiichiro that she wanted to respond properly to the genuine love and respect he held for Haku-sama. Since his praise had given her hope for the first time in years, she wanted to work hard and prove that his faith in her was not misplaced. Seiichiro smiled and agreed that they would do their best together. Once he returned home, however, Seiichiro finally allowed himself to think about what had happened. He had always been fascinated by the legend of the 8-foot-tall woman. What began as childhood fear had eventually become admiration, especially after his own growth spurt made him realize that he was naturally attracted to tall women. Now he had met the real Haku-sama, and she was far gentler and cuter than he had ever imagined. Still, Seiichiro made a strict rule for himself. He would not view Yachiru in the same indecent way that had already damaged her reputation. Thinking about her like that might weaken her powers, but more importantly, it would betray the trust she had placed in him. He was determined to keep his thoughts completely respectful, although the recent cafe incident had already shown him that maintaining that determination might be harder than expected. A short time later, Yachiru called him after carefully washing and ironing the jacket he had lent her. She thanked him again for helping, while Seiichiro assured her that he genuinely wanted to continue. They needed somewhere private for the next experiment, so he first suggested using a karaoke room. Yachiru had already researched that option and discovered that some rooms contained security cameras, which made it too risky. After considering other possibilities, Yachiru suggested going to Seiichiro's apartment. She asked whether his family would mind, and explained that she felt bad making him travel all the way to her home. Seiichiro admitted that he lived alone, though Although his apartment was very small, Yachiru said the size did not matter and added that they could choose somewhere else if he felt uncomfortable. Seiichiro looked toward his bed and immediately realized that inviting her into his apartment would test his self-control far more than her supernatural abilities. After using every reasonable thought still available to him, he suggested a manga cafe instead. The private rooms were affordable, and although they were not much larger than his apartment, the location would at least make the situation feel slightly less dangerous. Yachiru agreed, and the two arranged to meet there the following day. The next day, Yachiru arrived at the manga cafe before Seiichiro. He had been delayed on the way, so he called and told her to go inside without him. By the time he finally reached the counter, he had to present his ID to the employee before being allowed into the private room area. That suddenly made him wonder whether Yachiru even owned an identification card. She was a yokai who had been living among humans, so she probably had some way of handling things like this, but it was another reminder that he knew almost nothing about her daily life. For a brief moment, Seiichiro thought inviting her to his apartment might have been simpler. At least there would have been no staff, no ID checks, and no strangers walking through the hallway. Then he remembered exactly why he had rejected that idea and decided the manga cafe was still the safer choice for his peace of mind. He became so distracted by his own thoughts that he walked straight past their room. After realizing his mistake, he returned and knocked on the door, announcing that he was about to enter. Yachiru initially told him to come in, but her answer immediately changed into a panicked no. A loud crash followed from inside. Seiichiro opened the door without hesitation, worried that she had hurt herself. Instead, he found Yachiru collapsed on the floor while trying to change clothes. Her zipper had gotten stuck, and in the middle of struggling with it, she had lost her balance. Seiichiro froze for a second before quickly closing the door again. Whatever preparation he had done before coming there had clearly not included this situation. Yachiru tried opening the door to explain, but Seiichiro begged her to close it and finish getting dressed first. From the other side, she nervously told him that she had expected to be ready before he arrived. Still confused, Seiichiro asked why she had removed her undergarments at all. The explanation was practical, even if it had never crossed his mind. If Yachiru suddenly grew while wearing them, they could tear apart. Her oversized hoodie had enough room to survive at least part of the transformation, but regular clothes were far too expensive to keep replacing every time her body changed. Seiichiro finally understood the problem. They were experimenting with a supernatural growth ability, yet he had somehow only considered the room and not the clothing. Once Yachiru finished changing, she invited him inside and apologized for making him wait. Seiichiro entered cautiously, but the room was even smaller than he expected. There was barely enough space for the two of them at their normal sizes, which did not seem ideal when one of them could suddenly become 8 feet tall. He asked whether she was truly comfortable continuing in such a tight room. He reminded her that he was still a man and admitted that he did not want to accidentally think about her in an indecent way, especially when human perception directly affected her powers. If she felt uncomfortable, they could stop and find another location. Yachiru did not fully understand what he was worried about. From everything she had seen, Seiichiro was not the kind of person who would think strangely about her. She trusted him and urged him to come inside properly instead of standing beside the door. However, her confidence was mostly an act. Internally, Yachiru was extremely nervous about being dressed that way in front of a man. She knew she would have felt even more embarrassed inside his apartment, but because he was helping her, she did not want to complain or create another problem. She also did not want to admit how uncomfortable she felt because she worried it might make him uncomfortable as well. Before beginning the experiment, Yachiru handed Seiichiro a gift bag containing the jacket he had lent her at the cafe. She thanked him again and explained that she had cleaned and ironed it carefully. Seiichiro was surprised that she had gone through so much effort for something so small, but to Yachiru, returning it properly was the least she could do. She then straightened herself and declared that she would work hard to recover her powers, asking Seiichiro to continue supporting her. Her sudden determination helped settle her own nerves, and it also reminded Seiichiro why they were there. Whatever awkward thoughts had entered his mind, this was important to her. Before praising her again, Seiichiro decided they needed to understand more about her abilities. He believed it would be easier to discover what caused her growth if he knew how her powers originally worked. The changing size described in her legend was different from most of the yokai stories he had studied, so he wanted details from the real Hakusama herself. Yachiru explained that she had once been able to change her size freely. She mainly used the ability to blend in with humans whenever her original height attracted too much attention. Shrinking had once been a simple transformation she controlled by choice, but after her powers weakened, the smaller form became her normal state. Seiichiro leaned closer with obvious interest and asked whether she could also grow beyond her original height. Yachiru said she had never been able to become larger than her true form. She could once shrink easily, but growing back required strength she no longer possessed. He then asked whether she could make herself even smaller than she was now. Yachiru immediately rejected the idea. From her perspective, her current height was already humiliating enough, and she had no intention of discovering how much smaller she could become. Seiichiro could tell the subject bothered her, so he did not push any further. With the basic explanation complete, they began the experiment. Seiichiro praised Yachiru while asking more questions about her life and abilities. Unlike the cafe incident, he tried to keep his words controlled and observe exactly how her body reacted. Yachiru gradually increased in height as his compliments continued, confirming that his opinion of her was restoring at least part of her strength. At first, the process was awkward. Yachiru remained conscious of her clothing, while Seiichiro was careful about where he looked. But as they continued talking, both of them slowly relaxed. Yachiru became more comfortable explaining herself, and Seiichiro's praise felt less like part of an experiment and more like his honest opinion. Her body continued growing until the room could barely contain her. Her head was close to the ceiling, and she had almost no room left to move. Seiichiro turned toward the door and suggested ending the test before something broke. But Yachiru refused. This was the closest she had come to recovering her true size in years, and she wanted to know whether she could maintain it if he continued praising her. Seiichiro reluctantly agreed and kept going. He told her that she had already become much stronger and praised her for refusing to give up after so many failures. Hearing that, Yachiru reached out and asked him to give her his hand so they could test her strength. Before Seiichiro could properly respond, she grabbed him. Her restored power was far greater than either of them expected, and once her fingers closed around his arm, he could not move at all. Yachiru tightened her grip around Seiichiro's arm, and he immediately realized that her restored strength was no joke. No matter how hard he tried, he could not pull himself free. Meanwhile, Yachiru looked completely unaware of how powerful she had become. She was simply excited that her body had finally returned so close to its original size. Unfortunately, Seiichiro's mind was dealing with a completely different problem. Being held so closely by the woman he had admired since childhood was testing the promise he had made to himself. He'd sworn that he would never look at Yachiru indecently, both because he respected her and because those kinds of thoughts could negatively affect her powers. Yet his body was not cooperating with that noble mission at all. Yachiru noticed that he had gone quiet and asked whether his arms were getting tired. Before he could answer, her body suddenly began shrinking again. The change caused her to lose her balance, and since she was still holding onto him, she pulled Seiichiro down with her. A moment later, Seiichiro found himself lying directly on top of her. He immediately asked whether she was hurt, but the startled expression on her face made him realize how awkward their position was. He quickly moved away and apologized. Yachiru, however, was far more interested in the result of the experiment than what had just happened between them. She excitedly pointed out that it had taken much longer for her to shrink this time. That meant the praise might not only restore her size, but also help her maintain it for longer periods. Encouraged by the progress, she asked Seiichiro to continue. He refused and decided that they had done enough for the day. Yachiru had already pushed herself hard, and he did not want her exhausting herself just because she finally saw a chance to recover. He told her that her determination was one of her best qualities, but it could also become dangerous if she continued ignoring her own limits. Even if she regained her full strength, it would mean very little if she completely burned herself out in the process. They could continue experimenting another day after finding a safer method. Yachiru looked confused and asked whether he truly believed she had been neglecting herself. From Seiichiro's perspective, the answer was obvious. She had entered a tiny private room alone with a man while wearing nothing underneath an oversized hoodie, all because she did not want her clothes to tear during the experiment. The moment he pointed this out, Yachiru gripped the front of her hoodie and began panicking. She tried convincing herself that it had been acceptable because she trusted him. Then she worried that her behavior might have made him uncomfortable and immediately began apologizing again. In her mind, she had become another burden after he had already done so much to help her. Seiichiro stopped her before she could blame herself any further. He explained that trusting someone did not mean silently tolerating every uncomfortable situation. Real trust meant being honest enough to say when something felt wrong. He wanted her to tell him if she disliked an idea rather than forcing herself through it for his sake. He also admitted that the situation had been difficult for him. Yachiru might be a yokai, she was still a woman, and he was still a man sitting alone with her inside an extremely small room. He had tried remaining respectful, but pretending that the situation did not affect him would have been dishonest. Yachiru apologized once more and said that she had only been thinking about recovering her powers. She had never considered how uncomfortable the situation might be for him. Seiichiro gently asked her to slow down. He had not raised the issue to make her feel guilty. He only wanted them to communicate better before continuing their experiments. Once she had calmed down, he asked how she truly viewed him. Did she think he was the type of person who would become angry if she complained or refused something? Yachiru immediately said no. She did not believe Seiichiro would ever treat her that way. After thinking more carefully, she admitted that being with him felt safe, but she was still nervous about being alone with a man. The tiny room had made that fear even worse. She had hidden those feelings because she did not want to interrupt the experiment or seem ungrateful. Seiichiro thanked her for finally being honest. He agreed that the room had been a poor choice and promised that next time they would find somewhere larger and more comfortable. The goal was to help Yachiru rebuild her confidence, not place her in situations where she had to hide her discomfort. He then stepped into the hallway so she could change in privacy. While waiting outside, he thought about how surprising it was that Yachiru had been frightened the entire time. She had acted calm because she did not want to trouble him, which only proved how often she placed other people's comfort before her own. Seiichiro promised himself that he would prepare more carefully next time. He wanted to make sure she would never feel pressured to endure something unpleasant during their experiments. Then, after remembering the problem his body had caused earlier, he took out his phone and began searching for ways to control an unwanted physical reaction. Before he could finish reading, the door opened and Yachiru announced that she had changed. Seiichiro quickly put his phone away and asked whether she was ready to leave. However, Yachiru had noticed something when she first entered the cafe, an all-you-can-eat ice cream machine. Since they still had plenty of time before the manga cafe closed, she asked whether they could get some ice cream together before going home. She explained that she did not mind sitting in the room with him once she was properly dressed, and they could use the time to talk and learn more about each other without worrying about the experiment. Seiichiro happily agreed. After the awkwardness of the day, sharing ice cream and having a normal conversation sounded perfect. Because the ice cream machine suddenly broke, and Seiichiro had to rush off to find a staff member. If you've enjoyed the story so far, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment part 2 if you want us to continue.